The Mississippi heat pressed down on Magnolia Plantation like a suffocating blanket, making the air shimmer above the endless rows of cotton. The year was 1860, and the weight of an entire way of life hung as heavy as the humidity that clung to every surface, every breath, every soul trapped within the plantation's boundaries. Elijah had been picking cotton since dawn, his small fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had known no other life. At 11 years old, his hands were already calloused, his back already bent from the endless labor. The overseer, Mr. Garrett, rode his horse between the rows, his whip coiled at his side like a sleeping snake ready to strike. "Move faster, boy!" Garrett's voice cracked across the field like thunder. "Master Whitmore expects his quota filled by sundown." Elijah's cotton sack was nearly full when the pain struck. It started as a sharp burning in his chest, spreading outward like fire through his veins. He stumbled, gasping, his vision blurring as the world tilted sideways. The cotton plants seemed to grow taller, reaching toward him with gnarled fingers. "Elijah!" Sarah, an older slave woman who had helped raise him since his mother's death, rushed to his side. "Child, what's wrong?" But Elijah couldn't answer. His body convulsed once, twice, then went completely still. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and a strange, cold silence fell over that section of the field despite the oppressive heat. Dr. Morrison, the plantation's physician, was summoned from the big house. He was a thin, nervous man who treated the slaves with the same clinical detachment he might show a sick horse. After examining Elijah's motionless form, he shook his head gravely. "The boy is dead," he announced, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heart failure, most likely. The heat and exertion were too much for his young constitution." Master Whitmore, a portly man with cold gray eyes, stood over Elijah's body with barely concealed irritation. "Damn waste of property," he muttered. "That boy was worth at least $800. The slaves were ordered to prepare the body for burial. Sarah washed Elijah's small form with trembling hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Old Moses, the plantation's unofficial preacher, said what prayers he could over the child who had known nothing but bondage in his short life. They wrapped Elijah in a simple cotton shroud and placed him in a rough wooden box that had been hastily constructed by the plantation's carpenter. The burial was scheduled for the following morning, but as night fell, something strange began to happen. The temperature around Elijah's body began to drop, not gradually but suddenly, as if winter had descended on that one spot. The other slaves, keeping vigil in the small cabin where the body lay, pulled their thin blankets tighter around their shoulders. "Something ain't right," whispered Jeremiah, a field hand who had worked alongside Elijah. "Dead folks don't make the air cold like this." Sarah placed her hand near Elijah's face and jerked it back in shock. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed. "He's breathing." But that was impossible. "Doctor..." Morrison had declared the boy dead. There had been no pulse, no breath, no sign of life for hours. Yet now, in the flickering candlelight, they could see the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath the shroud. The second day brought no change. Elijah lay still as death, yet somehow alive. His skin was cold to the touch, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Dr. Morrison was called again, and he examined the boy with growing confusion and unease. "This is unprecedented," the doctor muttered, checking for a pulse that seemed to come and go like a whisper. "The boy shows signs of life, yet he remains completely unresponsive. I've never seen anything like it." Master Whitmore paced the cabin floor, his face red with frustration. "Is he alive or dead, Doctor? I need to know whether to bury him or put him back to work." I honestly cannot say," Dr. Morrison admitted, his hands shaking as he packed his medical bag. "Perhaps we should wait another day." The third day dawned grey and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The slaves went about their work with heavy hearts, glancing frequently toward the cabin where Elijah lay in his strange state between life and death. Some whispered that it was a sign from God, others feared it was something far darker. It was young Timothy, another slave child, who made the discovery that would change everything. He had been sent to check on Elijah's body when he came running back to the fields, his eyes wide with terror and wonder. "He's gone," Timothy shouted. "Elijah's gone. The box is empty." A search party was quickly organized. Master Whitmore, Dr. Morrison, Overseer Garrett, and several of the stronger slaves spread out across the plantation grounds. They searched the fields, the quarters, the woods that bordered the property. For hours, they found nothing. It was Sarah who spotted him first. She was walking along the banks of the muddy Mississippi River that flowed past the plantation when she saw a small figure sitting motionless on a fallen log at the water's edge. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the familiar silhouette. "Elijah," she whispered, then called out louder. "Elijah, child, is that you?" The boy turned slowly, and Sarah gasped. His eyes were open, clear and aware, but there was something different about them, something ancient and knowing that had never been there before. And there, visible through the torn fabric of his burial shroud, was a mark on his chest that made Sarah's blood run cold. A perfect cross, raised and red against his dark skin, as if it had been burned there by an invisible hand. Elijah looked at Sarah with those strange, knowing eyes and spoke his first words since returning from whatever place he had been. "I saw them, Miss Sarah," he said, his voice carrying an odd echo as if it came from somewhere far away. "I saw all the ones who came before and all the ones who will come after, and they told me things are about to change." As if summoned by his words, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened, sending down a torrent of rain that seemed to wash the very air clean. But nothing, Sarah knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, would ever be the same again. Word of Elijah's return spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried on whispered conversations and fearful glances. By evening, every soul on Magnolia Plantation knew that something impossible had occurred, something that challenged everything they thought they understood about life and death. Master Whitmore stood in his study, a crystal tumbler of bourbon trembling in his hand, as Dr. Morrison recounted what he had witnessed by the river. The cross-shaped mark on Elijah's chest defied all medical explanation, appearing as fresh as if it had been branded moments before, yet the boy showed no signs of pain or trauma. "You're telling me," Whitmore said slowly, "that a boy who was dead for 3 days simply walked to the river and sat down with some kind of religious marking that wasn't there before?" Dr. Morrison nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I've examined him thoroughly, Master Whitmore. The mark appears to be a scar, but it's unlike any scarring I've ever seen. It's perfectly symmetrical, raised exactly 1/8 of an inch from the skin and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "It's warm to the touch, even though the rest of his body remains unnaturally cold. What does the boy say about it?" "That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect," the doctor continued. "When I asked him about the mark, he simply said, 'It's where they touched me.' When pressed for details about who they might be, he becomes distant, as if he's listening to voices we cannot hear." Whitmore drained his bourbon and slammed the glass down on his mahogany desk. "I don't care if the boy sprouted wings and flew around the plantation. He's my property, and I'll not have superstitious nonsense disrupting my operation. Put him back to work tomorrow." But even as he spoke those words, Whitmore felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had built his fortune on the backs of human chattel, treating them as nothing more than livestock. Yet something about this situation made him profoundly uneasy, as if the very foundations of his world were beginning to shift. In the slave quarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension and wonder. Elijah sat on a wooden crate outside Sarah's cabin, surrounded by a circle of his fellow slaves. Children peered at him with wide eyes, while adults whispered prayers and made the sign of the cross. "Tell us again, child," urged old Moses, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Tell us what you saw in that place." Elijah's eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the circle of faces around him. When he spoke, his voice carried that same strange echo that had unnerved Sarah by the river. "It wasn't like here," he said slowly. "There was no heat, no cold, no masters, no whips, just light and voices. So many voices, singing songs I'd never heard but somehow knew all the words to." "Were they angels, boy?" asked Rebecca, a house slave whose faith had sustained her through 20 years of bondage. "Did you see the Lord's angels?" Elijah tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. "They said they were the ones who came before, the ones who suffered and died in chains, but whose spirits never broke. They said—" He paused, his small hand moving unconsciously to the cross-shaped mark on his chest. "They said the time of reckoning is coming, that the blood spilled on this land will cry out for justice." A collective shiver ran through the gathered slaves. These were words that, if overheard by the wrong ears, could result in brutal punishment or death. Yet something in Elijah's manner, in the certainty of his voice, made them lean closer rather than pull away. "What else did they tell you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They showed me things," Elijah replied, his eyes now focusing on the darkening sky above. "I saw this plantation burning. I saw Master Whitmore running through fields of fire, crying for mercy that will never come. I saw chains breaking and people walking free under a sky red with blood and smoke." The circle of slaves exchanged nervous glances. Such talk was dangerous beyond measure, yet they found themselves hanging on every word. There was something about the boy's manner, something in the way he spoke with such quiet conviction that made his words feel less like the fantasies of a child and more like prophecy. "When?" old Moses asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "When will these things come to pass?" Elijah stood up slowly, his movements oddly graceful for a child who had been picking cotton since he could walk. "Soon," he said simply. "Very soon. The voices told me to watch for the signs. And the first sign—" He pointed toward the big house, where lamplight flickered in the windows. "The first sign will be when the master's own blood turns against him." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted from the direction of the plantation house. Raised voices carried across the night air, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The slaves looked toward the disturbance, then back at Elijah, whose expression remained serene and knowing. "How could you know?" Sarah whispered, fear and wonder warring in her voice. "Because they're still here," Elijah replied, his hand once again touching the mark on his chest. "All of them. Every soul who ever suffered on this land. They're waiting, watching, and when the time comes—" He smiled, and for a moment he looked like nothing more than an 11-year-old boy. "When the time comes, they'll make sure justice is served." The argument from the big house grew louder, and now they could make out individual voices. Master Whitmore was shouting at someone, his words slurred with drink and rage. A younger voice responded with equal fury. Charles Whitmore, the master's eldest son, who had recently returned from his studies up north. "You can't keep treating them like animals forever, Father." Charles's voice carried clearly across the night air. "The world is changing. There are people in Washington talking about abolition, about ending this whole damned system." "You ungrateful whelp." Whitmore's roar was like that of a wounded beast. "Everything you have, everything you are, comes from this plantation, from the sweat and blood of those slaves." The sound of a door slamming echoed across the grounds, followed by the rapid hoofbeats of a horse being ridden hard into the night. Charles Whitmore was leaving, and from the sound of it, he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. The slaves in the circle around Elijah stared at him with a mixture of awe and terror. He had predicted this confrontation with impossible accuracy, speaking of it as if he had witnessed it before it happened. "The first sign," old Moses whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Lord have mercy. The boy spoke true." Elijah nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting the lamplight from the big house like twin stars. "They told me many things," he said quietly, "and they told me that some of you wouldn't live to see the end of what's coming. But they also told me that your children and your children's children will know freedom." As the night deepened around them, the slaves of Magnolia Plantation found themselves caught between hope and fear, between the brutal reality of their present and the impossible promise of a future they had never dared to imagine. And at the center of it all sat a small boy with ancient eyes and a cross-shaped scar, carrying within him secrets that defied all reason and understanding. The storm that had brought Elijah back to life was over, but a far greater tempest was brewing on the horizon, and whether it would bring salvation or destruction, none of them could say. The morning after Charles Whitmore's dramatic departure brought an oppressive stillness to Magnolia Plantation. The air hung thick and motionless, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Master Whitmore emerged from the big house looking haggard and disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from a night of drinking and rage. Overseer Garrett approached him cautiously, his usual swagger replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Master Whitmore, sir, about the boy, Elijah. The slaves are acting mighty strange around him. Maybe we should put him back to work," Whitmore snapped, cutting off the overseer's words. "I don't care if he glows in the dark and speaks in tongues. He's my property, and he'll earn his keep like every other slave on this plantation." But even as he gave the order, Whitmore couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The slaves moved differently now, their eyes holding a spark that hadn't been there before. They whispered among themselves in hushed tones, and when they looked at Elijah, it was with a mixture of reverence and anticipation that made the plantation owner's skin crawl. Doctor. Morrison had left early that morning, claiming urgent business in town, but Whitmore suspected the man was simply too unnerved by what he had witnessed to remain. The doctor's final words echoed in Whitmore's mind. Some things are beyond the realm of medical science, Master Whitmore. Perhaps it would be wise to consult with other authorities. Elijah was assigned to work in the cotton fields alongside the other children, but it quickly became apparent that his presence was having an unusual effect on those around him. The work songs that typically helped pass the long, brutal hours took on new melodies, harmonies that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sarah watched the boy carefully as he moved through the rows of cotton plants. His movements were different now, more deliberate, more purposeful. And wherever he walked, the plants seemed to respond to his presence. The cotton bolls appeared fuller, whiter, as if touched by some invisible blessing. "You see it too, don't you?" whispered Jeremiah, working alongside Sarah. The way the plants seemed to reach toward him. Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Elijah's small form. It's like they know he's different now, like they can sense whatever it is that happened to him. But it wasn't just the plants that seemed affected by Elijah's presence. The work tools, hoes, sickles, cotton sacks, seemed to move more smoothly in the hands of those working near him. Tasks that normally took hours were completed with surprising ease, and despite the oppressive heat, the slaves working in Elijah's section of the field showed no signs of the usual exhaustion. Overseer Garrett noticed the increased productivity and was torn between suspicion and satisfaction. His quota was being met ahead of schedule, which would please Master Whitmore, but the circumstances were so unusual that they made him deeply uncomfortable. "Keep an eye on that boy," he instructed his assistant, a cruel man named Pike who took particular pleasure in the suffering of others. "Something ain't right about him, and I don't like the way the others look at him." Pike nodded eagerly, his hand moving instinctively to the whip at his side. He had been looking for an excuse to discipline the slaves, and this strange situation with the boy might provide just the opportunity he needed. As the day wore on, more unusual occurrences began to manifest around Elijah. A broken water bucket that had been leaking for weeks suddenly held water without spilling a drop. A lame mule that had been scheduled for slaughter began walking normally after Elijah passed by its stall. Most disturbing of all, the plantation's hunting dogs, vicious animals trained to track runaway slaves, whimpered and cowered whenever they came near the boy. Word of these incidents reached Master Whitmore by midday, delivered by Pike with barely concealed excitement. "Master, sir, that boy is causing all kinds of strange happenings. The slaves are starting to think he's got some kind of powers." Whitmore's face darkened with anger and something that might have been fear. "Powers? What kind of superstitious nonsense is this?" "Well, sir," Pike continued, warming to his subject, "there's talk among them that he can heal things just by touching them, and they're saying he knows things that ain't happened yet." "Bring him to me," Whitmore ordered, "now." When Elijah was brought before the master of the plantation, he showed no sign of fear or deference. He stood straight and tall despite his small stature, his eyes meeting Whitmore's gaze with a directness that was both unusual and unsettling for a slave child. "Boy," Whitmore began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power, "I'm hearing disturbing reports about your behavior. The other slaves seem to think you've acquired some kind of special abilities." Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if listening to voices only he could hear. "They told me you would ask about this," he said quietly. "They told me what to say." "Who told you?" Whitmore demanded, leaning forward in his chair. "Who are these they you keep talking about?" "The ones who came before," Elijah replied, with that same strange echo in his voice. "The ones who built this plantation with their blood and sweat. The ones who died in these fields, in the quarters, under the lash. They're all still here, Master Whitmore, and they're waiting." A chill ran down Whitmore's spine, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. "Waiting for what?" Elijah's hand moved to the cross-shaped mark on his chest, visible through his torn shirt. "For justice. For the day when the chains will be broken and the oppressed will be set free. They showed me that day, Master Whitmore. They showed me what will happen to this place, and to you." "You dare threaten me?" Whitmore's voice rose to a roar, and he stood up so quickly that his chair toppled backward. "You're nothing but property, a piece of livestock that I own body and soul." "No," Elijah said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the room. "You never owned my soul, and soon you won't own anything at all." The temperature in the room began to drop, just as it had in the cabin where Elijah's body had lain. Whitmore's breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started to form on the windows, despite the blazing heat outside. What are you?" Whitmore whispered, backing away from the small boy who seemed to radiate an otherworldly presence. "I am what you made me," Elijah replied. "I am the voice of every slave who ever cried out for freedom. I am the witness to every injustice, every cruelty, every life cut short by your greed and hatred. And I am the herald of what's coming." The sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, growing closer by the second. Whitmore rushed to the window and saw a sight that made his blood run cold. A group of riders was approaching the plantation house. Union soldiers, their blue uniforms unmistakable even at a distance. "How?" he gasped, turning back to Elijah. "How could you know they were coming?" But the boy was gone. The room was empty except for Whitmore himself, standing alone in the supernatural cold that had no earthly explanation. Outside, the Union soldiers were dismounting, their faces grim with purpose. As Whitmore heard their boots on his front porch, he realized with growing horror that everything was unfolding exactly as the strange boy had predicted. The first sign had been his son's rebellion. Now came the second, the arrival of forces that would challenge everything he had built his life upon. And somewhere in the fields of Magnolia Plantation, a small boy with ancient eyes and a cross-shaped scar was preparing to witness the beginning of the end of a way of life built on human bondage and suffering. The reckoning had begun. The Union soldiers who rode onto Magnolia Plantation that sweltering afternoon were led by Captain James Morrison, a stern-faced man whose weathered features spoke of countless battles fought in the name of preserving the Union. His orders were clear: investigate reports of unusual activities at the plantation and assess the loyalty of its owner to the Confederate cause. Master Whitmore met them on his front porch, his face a mask of forced civility, despite the terror that gnawed at his insides. How had the boy known they were coming? How had he predicted this moment with such impossible accuracy? "Captain Morrison," Whitmore said, extending his hand in greeting, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" The captain ignored the offered handshake, his cold blue eyes scanning the plantation grounds with military precision. "We've received reports, Mr. Whitmore, that your plantation has been harboring Confederate sympathizers and possibly supplying the rebel army with cotton and provisions. I assure you, Captain, my loyalty to the Union is absolute," Whitmore lied smoothly. "I've always been a law-abiding citizen." But even as he spoke, Whitmore's eyes were drawn to the fields where his slaves continued their work. There, moving among the cotton plants with that same otherworldly grace, was Elijah. The boy seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and wherever he walked, the other slaves looked up from their labor with expressions of hope and anticipation. Captain Morrison followed Whitmore's gaze and frowned. "That boy there," he said, pointing toward Elijah. "There's something unusual about him. My men noticed it as we rode in. The other slaves seem to defer to him in some way." "He's just a field hand," Whitmore said quickly, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. "Nothing special about him at all." "I'd like to speak with him," Morrison said, and it wasn't a request. As they approached the field where Elijah worked, a strange thing happened. The other slaves began to gather around the boy, forming a protective circle that seemed to materialize without any visible signal or command. Old Moses stepped forward, his ancient frame somehow radiating dignity and strength. "You want to speak to the child?" Moses asked, his voice carrying an authority that made even the Union soldiers pause. "Then you speak to all of us. We are his people, and he is ours." Captain Morrison had seen many things in his years of military service, but the scene before him was unlike anything in his experience. The slaves stood together with a unity and purpose that seemed to transcend their circumstances. And at the center of it all was a small boy, whose presence seemed to transform everyone around him. "What's your name, son?" Morrison asked gently, addressing Elijah directly. "Elijah," the boy replied, his voice carrying that familiar echo. "And you are Captain James Morrison of the 14th Illinois Infantry. You have 3 children back home, Mary, John, and little Sarah. You carry their picture in your left breast pocket, next to your heart." Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, his face paling. He had never mentioned his family to anyone on this plantation, had never even spoken their names aloud. "How could you possibly know that?" "They told me," Elijah said simply. "The voices. They know many things about many people. They know about you, Captain Morrison. They know why you really came here." "I came here on military orders," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elijah shook his head slowly. "You came here because your brother died at Bull Run, because you've seen too much death, too much suffering, and you're looking for something to believe in, something that will make sense of all the pain." The captain staggered backward as if he had been struck. His brother's death at Bull Run was something he had never spoken of to anyone, a grief so deep and personal that he had buried it in the depths of his soul. "This is impossible," Morrison whispered. "You're just a child. How could you know these things?" "Because the dead speak to those who will listen," Elijah replied, his hand moving to the cross-shaped mark on his chest. "And they have much to say about the war that's coming, about the blood that will be spilled before this nation can be healed." Master Whitmore watched this exchange with growing horror. The boy was revealing things that no slave child should know, speaking with an authority that challenged the very foundations of the social order. If word of this spread, if people began to believe that the slaves possessed some kind of supernatural knowledge or power— "Captain," Whitmore interrupted desperately, "surely you can see that the boy is disturbed. Perhaps the heat has affected his mind. I assure you there's nothing supernatural happening here." But Morrison was no longer listening to the plantation owner. His attention was fixed entirely on Elijah, whose words had cut through his carefully constructed emotional defenses like a blade through silk. "What else do they tell you?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What else do the voices say?" Elijah's eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the cotton fields, beyond the plantation, beyond the present moment itself. "They say the war will be longer and bloodier than anyone imagines. They say that before it's over, brother will fight brother, and the land will be soaked with the blood of the innocent. But they also say—" He paused, his young face suddenly radiant with hope. "They also say that freedom will come, not just for the slaves, but for everyone who has been bound by hatred and fear." "When?" Morrison asked urgently. "When will it end?" "When the last chain is broken," Elijah replied. "When the last master learns that no human being can own another. When the last slave walks free under the same sky that covers us all." As if summoned by his words, a wind began to blow across the plantation, stirring the cotton plants and carrying with it the sound of distant thunder. But this was no ordinary storm approaching. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that made every person present feel as if they were standing on the edge of something momentous. "There's going to be a fire," Elijah said suddenly, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Tonight. The big house will burn and Master Whitmore will lose everything he has built on the backs of others." "What?" Whitmore spun around, his face contorting with rage and fear. "You little devil! Are you threatening me? Are you planning to burn down my house?" "I'm not planning anything," Elijah said calmly. "I'm simply telling you what the voices have shown me. The fire will start in your study, where you keep the records of every slave you've bought and sold, every family you've torn apart, every life you've destroyed for profit." Morrison looked from the boy to the plantation owner, his military instincts telling him that something significant was about to unfold. "Mr. Whitmore, I think it would be wise if you allowed my men to search your house, if there's any danger of fire." "Absolutely not," Whitmore snarled. "This is my property, and I'll not have Union soldiers ransacking my home based on the ravings of a slave child." But even as he spoke, a thin column of smoke was beginning to rise from one of the windows of the big house. The smell of burning paper and wood began to drift across the plantation grounds, carried by the same supernatural wind that had announced Elijah's prophecy. "It's starting," Elijah said quietly, his eyes reflecting the growing glow of flames, just as they said it would. And as the fire began to consume the symbol of everything that Magnolia Plantation represented, the slaves who had gathered around the strange boy with the cross-shaped scar began to understand that they were witnessing something far greater than the destruction of a single building. They were witnessing the beginning of the end of their bondage, foretold by a child who had returned from death itself to herald a new age of freedom and justice. The flames that consumed Master Whitmore's study spread with unnatural speed, as if fed by something more than mere wood and paper. Within minutes, the entire east wing of the plantation house was engulfed in an inferno that painted the darkening sky orange and red. The fire roared with a voice that seemed almost human, crying out in anguish and rage. Captain Morrison immediately ordered his men to form bucket brigades, but their efforts seemed futile against the supernatural intensity of the blaze. The flames danced and writhed as if alive, consuming everything that represented the plantation's legacy of human bondage. "My records!" Whitmore screamed, trying to rush toward the burning building before being restrained by Union soldiers. 20 years of business records, slave purchases, cotton sales, everything. "Let it burn," Elijah said quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly over the roar of the flames. "Let it all burn. The voices say that some things must be destroyed before new things can grow." As the fire raged, something extraordinary began to happen among the slaves. They stood together in the flickering light, no longer cowering or hiding, but standing tall with a dignity that seemed to transform them before everyone's eyes. Old Moses began to sing, his voice rising above the crackling flames. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." One by one, the other slaves joined in, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power and purpose. Sarah took Elijah's hand, tears streaming down her face as she sang. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never dared to feel before: hope. Captain Morrison watched in amazement as the scene unfolded before him. He had come to this plantation as a soldier following orders, but what he was witnessing transcended military duty. This was something spiritual, something that spoke to the deepest questions about human dignity and freedom. "Captain," one of his sergeants approached nervously, "what are your orders? Should we try to save the house?" Morrison looked at the flames, then at the slaves singing in the firelight, then at the small boy whose presence seemed to be at the center of everything. "No," he said finally, "let it burn. Some things need to burn before they can be rebuilt properly." As the fire continued to consume the plantation house, more strange phenomena began to manifest. The temperature around Elijah dropped dramatically, creating a circle of cool air in the midst of the blazing heat. Frost formed on the ground at his feet, and his breath misted in the frigid air that surrounded him like a protective barrier. "Look!" shouted one of the Union soldiers, pointing toward the flames. "Do you see them?" In the dancing fire, shapes began to appear, human figures that seemed to move independently of the flames themselves. They were translucent, ghostly but unmistakably present. Men, women, and children, all bearing the marks of bondage, all reaching toward the sky as if finally free to ascend. "The ones who came before," Elijah whispered, his eyes reflecting the supernatural light. "They're finally free to go. The fire is burning away the chains that bound them to this place." Master Whitmore fell to his knees as he watched his life's work consumed by flames that seemed to burn with the accumulated rage and sorrow of every slave who had ever suffered on his plantation. "This is impossible," he moaned. "This can't be happening." "It's justice," said a voice behind him. He turned to see his son Charles, who had returned just in time to witness the destruction. "It's what you deserve for building your fortune on human misery." "Charles!" Whitmore reached toward his son with desperate hands. "Help me, we can rebuild, we can start over." But Charles stepped back, his face hard with resolve. "No, father, this ends here. I've seen what slavery does to people, both the enslaved and the enslavers. I won't be part of it anymore." As father and son faced each other in the firelight, Elijah approached them with that same otherworldly grace that had marked all his movements since his return from death. The cross-shaped scar on his chest seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The voices have something to say to you, Master Whitmore," Elijah said, his young voice carrying the weight of centuries. "They want you to know that every lash of the whip, every family torn apart, every life destroyed for profit, it all ends tonight." "I don't believe in your voices," Whitmore snarled, but his voice cracked with fear. "You're just a child, a piece of property." "I was never your property," Elijah replied calmly. "None of us were. We are human beings, created in the image of God, and no man has the right to own another." The fire reached its peak intensity, And in that moment, something miraculous occurred. The flames began to form shapes, letters, words written in fire across the night sky. Everyone present, slaves, soldiers, master and son, could read the message that blazed above them. "Let my people go." The words hung in the air for a long moment, burned into the retinas of everyone who witnessed them, before the fire began to subside. As the flames died down, the plantation house was revealed to be completely destroyed, reduced to smoldering ruins and ash. But from those ashes, something new was beginning to emerge. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority and purpose. "By the power vested in me by the United States Army," he announced, "I hereby declare all slaves on this plantation to be free. You are no longer property. You are free men and women with all the rights and dignity that freedom entails." The slaves looked at each other in wonder and disbelief. Freedom. The word they had whispered in secret, dreamed of in the darkness, prayed for in their deepest despair, it was finally theirs. Sarah knelt beside Elijah, her weathered hands framing his young face. "Is it real, child? Are we truly free?" Elijah smiled, and for the first time since his return from death, he looked like nothing more than an 11-year-old boy. "Yes, Miss Sarah. The voices told me this day would come. They told me that the fire would burn away the old world and make room for the new." As dawn began to break over the ruins of Magnolia Plantation, the former slaves gathered their few possessions and prepared to walk into an uncertain but hopeful future. Some would stay to work the land as free laborers. Others would journey north in search of family members sold away years before. But all of them carried with them the memory of a small boy who had returned from death itself to herald their freedom. A child whose impossible resurrection had been the first sign of a new age dawning in America. The fire had burned away more than just a plantation house. It had burned away an entire way of life built on human bondage, clearing the ground for something better to grow in its place. And at the center of it all, Elijah stood with his hand on the cross-shaped scar that marked him as a witness to the power of justice and the inevitability of freedom. The morning sun rose over the smoldering ruins of Magnolia Plantation like a promise of redemption, casting long shadows across the ash-covered ground where the big house had stood. The air still carried the acrid smell of smoke, but there was something else in the atmosphere now, the electric feeling of change, of a world being reborn. Captain Morrison had spent the night organizing his men and documenting the events that had transpired. His official report would struggle to capture the supernatural elements of what he had witnessed, but he knew he had to try. The Union Army needed to understand that something profound was happening in the South, something that went beyond military strategy and political maneuvering. The former slaves of Magnolia Plantation gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their few possessions bundled in cloth sacks and worn blankets. For many of them, these were the only belongings they had ever been allowed to call their own. Now, as free people, they faced the daunting prospect of building new lives from nothing. Elijah moved among them like a shepherd tending his flock, offering words of comfort and guidance that seemed to come from a wisdom far beyond his 11 years. The cross-shaped scar on his chest had stopped glowing, but it remained visible through his torn shirt, a permanent reminder of his journey to the realm beyond death. "Where will we go?" asked Rebecca, the house slave whose faith had sustained her through decades of bondage. "We have no money, no land, nowhere to call home." "Home isn't a place," Elijah replied, his voice carrying that familiar echo. "Home is where people are free to be who God made them to be. The voices told me that many of you will find homes in places you never imagined, with people who will welcome you as family." Old Moses approached the boy, his weathered face creased with concern. "Child, what about you? Will you come with us when we leave this place?" Elijah looked toward the ruins of the plantation house, then back at the assembled group of former slaves. "My work here isn't finished yet," he said quietly. "There are others who need to hear what the voices have to say, others who need to understand that change is coming whether they welcome it or not." As if summoned by his words, Master Whitmore emerged from the overseer's cabin where he had spent the night. His clothes were rumpled and stained with ash, his face haggard with grief and shock. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over hundreds of human beings now looked broken and defeated. "You," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Elijah, "this is all you're doing. You brought this curse upon my family, upon my plantation." "I brought nothing," Elijah replied calmly. "I simply announced what was already coming. The voices don't create justice. They reveal it. Charles Whitmore stepped between his father and the boy, his face set with determination. "Father, it's over. The old ways are dead and buried. We have a chance now to build something better, something based on human dignity instead of human bondage." "Better?" Whitmore's voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "You call this better? I've lost everything. My house, my fortune, my way of life." "You've lost nothing that was rightfully yours to begin with," Charles replied firmly. "The only thing you truly owned was your choice of how to treat other human beings, and you chose cruelty over compassion, profit over humanity." Captain Morrison approached the family confrontation with several of his soldiers. "Mr. Whitmore," he said formally, "I'm placing you under arrest on charges of treason against the United States. We found Confederate correspondence in the ruins of your study, evidence that you've been supplying the rebel army with cotton and provisions." As the soldiers moved to restrain him, Whitmore's eyes fixed on Elijah with a mixture of hatred and terror. "What are you?" he whispered. "What kind of demon are you?" "I'm not a demon," Elijah said softly. "I'm a witness. I'm the voice of everyone you ever hurt, everyone you ever owned, everyone whose life you treated as worthless. And I'm here to tell you that your victims have not been forgotten." The temperature around Elijah began to drop again, and frost formed on the ground despite the warm morning air. In that supernatural cold, shapes began to appear, the ghostly figures of slaves who had died on the plantation over the years, men who had been worked to death in the fields, women who had died in childbirth with no medical care, children who had succumbed to disease and malnutrition. They stood in silent accusation around Whitmore, their translucent forms bearing the marks of their suffering, whip scars, shackle marks, the hollow eyes of those who had died without hope. "Do you see them?" Elijah asked, his voice echoing with otherworldly authority. "Do you see all the lives you destroyed in pursuit of wealth and power?" Whitmore fell to his knees, his hands covering his face as he was confronted with the full weight of his crimes. "I didn't know," he sobbed. "I didn't understand. I thought they weren't really human. I thought it was the natural order of things." "Ignorance is not innocence," Elijah replied. "The voices told me that every person who participates in the enslavement of others knows in their heart that it's wrong. You chose to ignore that knowledge because it was profitable to do so." The ghostly figures began to fade as the supernatural cold dissipated, but their message had been delivered. Justice had been witnessed, truth had been spoken, and the reckoning was complete. As Whitmore was led away in chains, a bitter irony that was not lost on anyone present, the former slaves of Magnolia Plantation began their exodus. Some headed north toward the promise of jobs in factories and freedom in cities where slavery had never taken root. Others traveled west, seeking land they could call their own and communities where they could build new lives. Sarah lingered beside Elijah, reluctant to leave the boy who had become a symbol of hope and transformation. "Are you sure you won't come with us, child? You're family to us now." Elijah hugged her tightly, and for a moment, the ancient wisdom in his eyes was replaced by the simple affection of a child for a beloved caregiver. "I'll always be with you, Miss Sarah, all of you. The voices told me that the bonds forged in suffering and hope are stronger than any chains ever made." As the last of the former slaves disappeared down the dusty road that led away from Magnolia Plantation, Elijah stood alone among the ruins. The cross-shaped scar on his chest began to glow softly, and he could hear the voices calling to him from across the vast expanse of the south. There were other plantations, other slaves, other masters who needed to hear the message of coming change. The war that would tear the nation apart was still in its early stages, and there would be much suffering before freedom finally triumphed. But the boy who had returned from death itself to herald a new age of justice was ready for whatever lay ahead. He had seen the end of the story, had witnessed the ultimate victory of human dignity over human bondage. And he would carry that message to every corner of the South until every chain was broken and every slave walked free under the same sky that covered them all. 5 years had passed since the fire that consumed Magnolia Plantation, and the war that Elijah had prophesied was finally drawing to a close. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its way of life forever changed. But from those ruins, something new was emerging, a nation struggling to live up to its founding promise that all men are created equal. Captain Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, had followed Elijah's story throughout the war. Reports had reached him from across the South of a mysterious boy who appeared at plantations and battlefields, always bringing messages of hope to the enslaved and warnings of justice to their oppressors. Some called him an angel, others a prophet. A few dismissed him as a legend, a story told by desperate people clinging to hope in dark times. But Morrison knew better. He had seen the boy with his own eyes, had witnessed the impossible things that surrounded his presence. And now, as the war neared its end, he found himself drawn back to the place where it had all begun. The ruins of Magnolia Plantation were overgrown with vines and weeds, nature reclaiming what human ambition had built on the foundation of human suffering. The cotton fields had gone wild, the slave quarters stood empty and crumbling. But there, sitting on the same fallen log by the river where he had first been found after his resurrection, was Elijah. He looked exactly the same as he had 5 years before, still 11 years old, still bearing the cross-shaped scar on his chest, still radiating that otherworldly presence that marked him as something beyond ordinary human understanding. "Colonel Morrison," Elijah said without turning around, his voice carrying across the water. "I've been waiting for you." Morrison dismounted from his horse and approached slowly, still awed by the boy's presence after all these years. "Elijah, I've heard stories about you from all across the South. They say you've been appearing at plantations, helping slaves escape, warning of Union advances." "I've been doing what the voices told me to do," Elijah replied, finally turning to face the officer. "Spreading the message that freedom is coming, that justice cannot be delayed forever." "The war is almost over," Morrison said, settling down beside the boy on the log. "Lee will surrender soon. Slavery will be abolished throughout the nation. Your prophecies have come true." Elijah nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "The legal chains will be broken, yes. But the voices tell me that other chains will take their place. Chains of hatred, of fear, of economic oppression. The struggle for true freedom will continue long after the last shot is fired." "What do you mean?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Freedom is more than just the absence of chains," Elijah explained, his young voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. "It's the presence of justice, of equality, of human dignity. The voices show me a future where the descendants of slaves will still struggle for these things, where the color of a person's skin will still determine how they're treated by society." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. How long? How long will this struggle continue? Elijah's eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the present moment, seeing into a future that stretched across generations. 100 years, 200, maybe more. But the voices also show me something else. They show me that the struggle will not be in vain. They show me a day when a man will stand before a great crowd in the nation's capital and speak of a dream where all people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. "Will you be there to see it?" Morrison asked. Elijah smiled, and for a moment he looked like nothing more than a child contemplating a distant adventure. "In a way, yes. The voices tell me that every person who fights for justice, who stands up against oppression, who refuses to accept that some humans are worth less than others, they all carry a part of me with them, a part of everyone who ever suffered for the cause of freedom." As the sun began to set over the ruins of the plantation, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields, Elijah stood up from the log. The cross-shaped scar on his chest began to glow with that familiar inner light, and the temperature around him dropped dramatically. "It's time," he said simply. "Time for what?" Morrison asked, though he already sensed the answer. "Time for me to go back to where I came from. My work here is finished. The message has been delivered, the prophecy fulfilled. The voices are calling me home." The ghostly figures began to appear again, not just the slaves who had died on Magnolia Plantation, but thousands of others from across the South. Men, women, and children who had lived and died in bondage, all reaching out toward Elijah with expressions of gratitude and love. "Thank you," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing us that justice is possible, that change can come even when it seems impossible." Elijah turned to him one last time, his ancient eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. "Remember what you've seen here, Colonel. Remember that the impossible becomes possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. And remember that the voices of the oppressed never truly die. They echo through history until justice is finally served. The boy began to walk toward the ghostly figures, his small form becoming translucent as he moved. With each step he seemed to fade a little more, until he was nothing more than a shimmer in the evening air. "Will we see you again?" Morrison called out. Elijah's voice came back to him like an echo from across time itself. Whenever people cry out for freedom, whenever the oppressed refuse to accept their oppression, whenever someone stands up and says that all human beings deserve dignity and respect, I'll be there. We'll all be there. And then he was gone, vanishing into the gathering darkness along with the ghostly figures of all those who had suffered and died for the cause of human freedom. The ruins of Magnolia Plantation stood silent and empty, but somehow they no longer felt haunted. Instead, they felt peaceful, as if a great burden had finally been lifted. Colonel Morrison stood alone by the river for a long time, processing what he had witnessed. When he finally mounted his horse and rode away, he carried with him a story that would be passed down through generations, the story of a boy who had returned from death itself to herald the end of slavery and the beginning of a long struggle for true equality. Years later, when Morrison was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, he would speak of Elijah not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a symbol of something profoundly human: the refusal to accept injustice as permanent, the insistence that all people deserve freedom and dignity, and the faith that righteousness will ultimately prevail over oppression. The boy who had defied death and reason had left behind something more powerful than any miracle. He had left behind hope. Hope that justice, though delayed, would never be denied. Hope that the arc of history, however long, would bend toward freedom. Hope that the voices of the oppressed would never be silenced, no matter how powerful their oppressors might seem. In the decades that followed, as America struggled through Reconstruction and beyond, stories of Elijah spread throughout the South and eventually across the entire nation. Former slaves told their children about the boy with the cross-shaped scar who had prophesied their freedom. Union soldiers shared tales of the mysterious child who had appeared at crucial moments during the war, always bringing messages of hope and justice. Some dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of legends that emerge during times of great upheaval and change. But others recognized something deeper in the tale of Elijah, a truth about the power of faith, the inevitability of justice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to accept oppression as their permanent condition. The ruins of Magnolia Plantation eventually disappeared entirely, reclaimed by the Mississippi earth and overgrown by vegetation. But the memory of what had happened there lived on, passed down through oral tradition and written accounts, becoming part of the larger story of America's long journey toward the fulfillment of its founding ideals. And sometimes, in moments of great struggle and social upheaval, people would claim to see him again, a small boy with ancient eyes and a cross-shaped scar, appearing wherever the fight for human dignity was being waged. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, some marchers swore they saw him walking alongside them as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Others claimed to have glimpsed him in the crowd when Dr. King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Whether these sightings were real or imagined mattered less than what they represented: the enduring power of hope, the persistence of justice, and the unshakable belief that no human being should ever be considered the property of another. The story of Elijah, the 11-year-old slave boy who returned from death to herald the end of bondage, became more than just a tale of the supernatural. It became a testament to the idea that even in the darkest moments of human history, when evil seems triumphant and justice appears impossible, there are forces at work that cannot be defeated by whips or chains or laws designed to dehumanize. It became a reminder that the voices of the oppressed once raised can never truly be silenced. They echo through time, growing stronger with each generation, until they become a chorus so powerful that even the mightiest systems of oppression cannot withstand their call for freedom. And in that way, the boy who had defied explanation, who had challenged reason itself, achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly power could grant or take away. He lived on in every act of courage, every stand for justice, every refusal to accept that some people are worth less than others. The cross-shaped scar that had marked his chest became a symbol not of suffering but of redemption, proof that even the greatest injustices could be overcome, that even death itself could not silence the cry for human dignity and freedom. In the end, Elijah's story was not really about the supernatural at all. It was about something far more powerful and far more real: the unquenchable human desire for freedom, the irrepressible hope for justice, and the absolute certainty that, no matter how long it takes, truth will ultimately prevail over falsehood, love over hatred, and freedom over bondage. The boy who had returned from death had delivered his message, and that message would echo through the ages: let my people go, all of them, forever.